Good evening, everyone, and thank you once again to Neha for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you and to kick off the proceedings with such an amazing lineup of speakers. So I want to speak to you today about an idea that I have been playing around with in my head for about a year now, exactly a year in fact. And it's not just an idea. It's an idea that we're trying to turn into reality, and many of my colleagues from What's Up Bharat are here today. But today I just want to focus on the idea itself. Tell the truth and trust the people. What does this mean? So before I start, I want to ask everyone here, I've got the lights in my face, so I can't see everyone's face, but maybe by show of hands, how many of you agree with this question? Do you agree that the statement, greed is good? How many of you here agree with this? So very few. Okay, another question. Sorry. Do you think the philosophy of non-violence is relevant in India or the world today? So definitely more than the previous question. So this is just to get us kicked off on what can polling mean. So we asked this question to 500 kids in Delhi University. These were students who were part of the Manthan Street Play Society. So you can see they also similarly kind of answered. Definitely more people answered yes to the second question. But it depends on who we asked. If we had asked maybe the Ayn Rand Club or the shareholders of Reliance, maybe we would have gotten different answers. But this is just an interesting point. So just a very quick introduction about myself. Neha gave a little bit of background. So for the last 30 years, I have been trying to figure out things, right? Who am I? What am I trying to do? What do I want to do in life? What's happening in my head? What's happening in the world? And I still don't have any good answers to share with you. But one thing that I did learn was the importance of this principle of balance. So we like to call it the MBA mystical balance, or some people call it the corporate hippie balance, or head and heart, facts and feelings. It's a very basic concept. So I started my life 5 years ago when I moved back to India after growing up in New York as an investment banker. 2 years later, I became a social venture capitalist and started looking at investing in the base of the pyramid and building social impact, but in a for-profit manner. So I've successively been sort of making this journey, and now, as Neha said, like many other TED speakers, gone completely crazy and become almost a pure jholawala. So this concept of social commercial balance is what I've been exploring, and exactly 1 year ago, I finally came across that idea that helped me find that balance. And what is that idea? So this is just a quick anecdote. In 1946, Life magazine in the US asked 15 or so eminent American potential presidential hopefuls to summarize in 150 words or less, what would be the first 2 things you do if you were the president, or worded in that way. And Mr. Pew answered it in just 7 words. Tell the truth and trust the people. And I just put the flag there because this is happening around the same time that our country was gaining its independence. We have a small problem here with the clicker. But 5 years later, or 7 years later, his relative or colleague defined this in a more detailed way. What does this mean? No subversive force can conquer a nation that has not first been conquered by subversive inactivity on the part of its citizens who have failed in their duty to serve their country. What does this mean? It basically made me realize you can't just blame the government or the system, right? You have to look at how can, what's happening with the public, what's happening with the citizenry. And this was the idea of Pew, an open polling platform where different people can figure out what does everyone think on different social issues. In the case of the United States, on Republicans, on Democrats, on races, how do Americans feel about blacks, Asians, and so on. And everyone is aware of that information. So this is the idea. So, that was just the intro. In the next 10 minutes, I want to sort of take you through this in 3 steps. First is to talk about feelings. What are feelings? How do you measure feelings? Secondly, just looking at a few trends. What's happening in India right now? How can we understand sort of what's going on so we know what to measure? And then finally, give you a small introduction to this model for polling for India. So what are feelings? How do we measure them? Why is it important? So we start at a very basic psychological level. How do you feel? It depends. What's your mood? Your psychological state or mood has a big bearing on your feeling. That's a very obvious fact. Another way to look at it is, what's your personality? So a very famous German philosopher known as Carl Gustav Jung, and now there's a Myers-Briggs is a modern equivalent of this. I'm not sure how many people here have taken that test, but we would highly recommend that. This is a detailed test which helps tell you what kind of personality you have, because human beings think in different ways. So it's always useful to also know this, to understand how people are different. And of course, a very important point about this is, most of us probably in this room, we would be able to talk about this, but many people don't have that opportunity. This is a concept known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you don't have your basic needs for survival, home, food, shelter, you're not thinking about these things. Then you have social needs, interacting with people, making friends and so on. Then you have higher order psychological needs and spiritual needs. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. So those are feelings in general. When we talk about feelings on social issues, we're not talking about who are you going to vote for, what kind of market research, mobile phone you want to buy, what kind of cricket celebrity or Bollywood celebrity you like. We're asking you about things which are national issues. But you can ask someone on that regarding the policy implication. So look at this question: should we make anti-terrorism laws tougher, even if it causes human rights violation? Or you can also ask someone a related question in the personal domain. What would you think about giving the defense colony local policeman increased rights? Do you think that he would commit more violence and so on? And the answers may be different. And similarly for that other question, when we asked the 500 students from Delhi University, for example, on the issue of gender and homosexuality, 95% or something like that said yes, that they support greater rights. But when we started asking them a bunch of questions about that in their personal life, this is not a directly comparable question, obviously, but when we asked them, would you have a eunuch as a close personal friend, only 1/3 said yes. So it's just something to think about, that when you're asking about social issues, it's not just as obvious as, would you want India's stance on climate change, or do you think we should have women reservations, just by itself. You have to ask a series of questions on that topic to be able to tease out what do people really think. And of course, the most important thing is not just what do they think in the aggregate, but who thinks what. What if I was to tell you that most of the answers to one of the questions came from a particular gender, or from a particular age group, or for that matter, any other demographic, a religious group, or something like that. So this is what we try to do, is ask questions on important social issues and try to give you a breakup of how are different people answering these questions in a different way. And of course, I just want to quickly mention on feelings that what you feel is not the same thing as who you are, what you do, how you do it, or why you do it. This is it's mentioned there on the slide. We are correlating demographics. For example, who you are with how you feel. But this is just a very, very small beginning. And to measure correlations and causation, and is something causing something else, it's a lot of additional work that can be done on this. So this is just a sort of a very, very initial introduction. So that's feelings. What do we mean by measuring feelings? Why is this different from the typical polling that happens here? So what's happening in India today? A lot of us talk about the bottom of the pyramid, the base of the pyramid, right? You see the statistics over there. Families who earn less than 1 lakh a year as an entire family for the whole year. 135 million such households. Multiply that number by 5. That's the average household size. Half a billion people in that level. But that's not the real story. Those are numbers from 5 years ago. Now people are talking about the emerging middle, which is people, again, you can look at that more precisely, families with household income between 1.5 and 3 lakhs. That's half of our population, 500 million people, and a $500 billion market. So this is really the essence. People in the middle class, people in the lower middle class, this new emerging middle that's forming. And of course, when you connect the dots here, a lot of the people who are very poor, and you look at the demographic dividend. Many people talk about the demographic dividend, and they don't always recognize that the demographic dividend is taking place in the North India, where we are today. Something like 95% of the additions to the workforce in India are going to come from the 5 Hindi-speaking states, which are the slowest growing states. And as a result, people say, well, in the past we've grown fast, we haven't had social issues. In the future, that may not be the same. That's called connecting the dots. Some of you may have read the book, The White Tiger. It talks about one example of one such person who has aspirations, and the reality doesn't match up to that, and he basically becomes a revolutionary, if you will. So that is a very, very scary phenomenon which can increase. So just to put that in context, the title of this slide is A Brief History of Big Ideas. How many of you guys are familiar with this, this icon or this logo? So this is, yes, Aditya, so this is the French Revolution. Liberté, fraternité, égalité, basic ideas. So just to put this in context, what does this mean? We've had three great forces of the 20th century. Not these ones, the ones that defeated them. So nationalism defeated imperialism, not just in India, the world over. Democracy defeated dictatorship in Europe and many other places. And of course, more recently, though the Chinese model is still very much there, capitalism overall has defeated communism. So what does this mean for us today? This is very basic stuff. Lots of young people in India today are getting engaged in these issues in these different ways. We talk about social entrepreneurship, helping rich and poor, environment, sustainability, and so on and so forth. Social justice, people getting involved in, you know, gender issues, religious issues, and so on. And then, of course, hardcore political stuff, which deals with basic freedom, right? Corruption, Anna Hazare, governance, security, human rights, Maoism, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of activity that's happening here. And in particular, if you look at, let's say, social innovation, people talk about the Grameen Bank, microfinance, things like that. But social innovation has many, many aspects to it. Even in the corporate world, I mean, I'm using Vedanta as not as an example of a socially conscious company, but even them, a company that does mining, and which is considered, you know, not social, even they're doing CSR, right? Another corporate does CSR more credibly. That's the Tatas. So people give them more credit for it. And you look at the right side of that page, things like the mobile revolution, right? Airtel has given, or not Airtel itself, but the mobile revolution has given 800 million people in India access to making a telephone call at a few paise. Now, is that more social or, you know, delivering education in a slum to 50 kids? So this is the idea of sort of how do you connect the dots? This is how we typically connect the dots. If I have a question, what do? I'll go to Google, I'll watch the news, I have my laptop, my phone, and so on. But really, it's about the internet. And if you look at these stats, I've pulled these stats out from different places. The point that this shows you is very interesting. This roughly, if you take the average of 350 and 280, about 300 million people in India today who speak English and who know how to use a computer and who basically have access to a computer. PC penetration is not the biggest challenge, but only 80 million, and that's probably an inflated number, something like 65, 70 million, are using the internet, and a lot of them are using social networks. So there's a huge potential for the penetration of this to go once the broadband availability and cost comes down, which is indeed what the government is now talking about. So I disagree with people who feel, and we've got very detailed stats, in fact, to show exactly how the penetration of internet and mobile is increasing in rural India. And that's exactly why the government, for the first time, is getting interested in this stuff, right? They don't care what a few people in the cities talk and write about, but when this is affecting vast swaths of society, why is the government of India getting involved in what should be on Facebook and Twitter, right? Just like the Chinese government, because it's important. And it's not just the government, of course. This is the last slide for this section. This is talking about the various people doing various interesting things. So you've got physical hubs, cafes where people meet, cultural hubs. One of them we're sitting in right now, Habitat Center. Then you've got new media, online activism. But what is all of this? How do you tie all of this together? You have physical hubs, you have online communities, and then you have people delivering certain services. Some of them are in this room, you know, the organizations listed there. So again, just a way to sort of connect the dots. And the final way to connect the dots is, someone once told me, if you're not a 9-to-5 corporate stooge, then what are you? What can you do in your life? And this is sort of an integrated way of thinking about that. Either you're a creative person. You're like, I'm going to create something. I want to make a film. You know, I want to do something. Or you're an intellectual person. You want to write a book. You want to teach. You have some ideas. Or you're a professional. You're like, I just want to do something. I want to be an entrepreneur. So these are three different kinds of personalities. And at the end of the day, all of them are working on similar issues. But often they don't connect with each other. They live in their own little worlds, you know? So again, another final example of connecting the dots. So this is the context of sort of what we feel is happening in India and how we see the importance of trying to gauge people's feelings. So what do we mean by polling? Polling today is either about politics, right? This is the most obvious form. Who are you going to vote for? Or business, market research. Do you want a Motorola? Do you want Nokia? Do you want this kind of flower, you know, what are people's preferences on buying stuff? That's not a poll, that's market research. And media does often, they talk about polls, right? QOTD, question of the day. That's not a poll. Or at least it's not a meaningful poll. What we're talking about is public opinion polling, which has 3 aspects to it. The first is demographic data capture. So you figure out who are the people that you're polling, what's their gender, what's their age, what's the region that they're from. There's no limit to the questions you can ask them if they're willing to give you that information. Are you rich, poor, or medium? Anything. And you capture that so that when you get the polling results, you can cross-correlate those demographic factors and see if there's any relevance. Of course, you have to actually create those questions. So what are the issues you're going to poll about? How are you going to make sure those questions are neutral and that they're relevant for policymakers? And then, of course, you share the answers with the public. So the people who take the poll can actually see the results. It's not just that you do it, you get the data, and you sell it. That's what makes it a social enterprise. And before I conclude, I just want to also add, and I won't go too much into this, that you can't just do this on the internet or with people who speak English. So ultimately, to do real proper polling, the polls have to be translated into Hindi. It has to be done offline. And by the way, that's the most interesting demographic. The people who take the poll in English, the people who take the poll in Hindi. And then after, let's say you take the corruption poll. Do you support Anna Hazare? You say yes. Yes, no, maybe, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And you click on Hindi versus English, and you get 2 charts. Immediately, visually, it tells you, how are Bharat and India thinking differently, and it's actually much better than asking someone their income level. They may not disclose it, it may not be accurate, but people who took that poll in Hindi, that's the closest you can get to a proxy for that. So we're trying to do this on an offline basis as well. And of course, the idea is we're currently doing this in Delhi, but I won't go into the details of the What's Up Bharat business model, but the idea is to do this in such a way that it can rapidly scale. And you can set up these hubs at different college campuses in different cities and make it a scalable model. And ultimately, what are we trying to do? So we talked about art, ideas, action. It's a 3-step process. Initially, for someone to get engaged in social issues, they have to be inspired. They have to first get inspired. So art does that. Not everyone is literate. If I try to, give a book to someone, that may not be as impactful as a video, which can reach many more people. So that's art. After that, they want to get engaged. They want to actually understand the issue. So you've shown me a video on corruption, and I'm passionate. Now I want to understand it. That's where the polling, the research, the data comes in. Okay, then, but even that's not enough. Now the person is engaged. Now what do they do? So in the offline platform, you also have to do programs. You have to actually give them tools, classes, funding, resources, and so on. So this is what we mean when we say art, ideas, action. It's a 3-step process, and different customers will engage, and the customers come from across that emerging middle. So this is a summary of what we're trying to do, and I hope you found it interesting. And again, if there are any questions, we'll be around all evening. So again, thank you very much, and thank you once again, Neha.